The interior of the U-1232 was a lightless, vibrating tube of grease, diesel fumes, and human desperation. As the boat plunged into the violent, churning swells of the North Atlantic, the crew lived in a state of permanent, rhythmic nausea. The air was a thick, recycled soup of carbon dioxide, and the metallic tang of sweat, so heavy it felt as though it could be cut with a combat knife. Every few minutes, a rogue wave hammered the iron hull with the force of a falling building, sending a shudder through the bulkheads that rattled the teeth of the men huddled in their bunks. These sailors were not hunting Allied convoys or stalking tankers. They were weather prophets, tasked with a mission far more abstract and arguably more dangerous. In the cramped radio room, the operator's fingers danced over the keys of an Enigma machine. He was busy translating barometric pressures and wind speeds into encrypted strings of gibberish. Outside, the worst storm in a generation was brewing, a gargantuan atmospheric wall that would soon sweep across the European continent. This data was the secret trigger, a silent countdown being fed back to the Corrali bunker in Berlin. The German High Command was not just planning a battle. They were weaponizing the climate, waiting for the precise moment when a ceiling of impenetrable grey mist would descend over the Ardennes forest. This fog would ground the terrifying might of the Allied air forces and turn the sky into a useless, empty void. But to understand this atmospheric gamble, we must look back to the concrete silence of the Wolf's Lair. The atmosphere inside the bunker was one of stifling, airless paranoia, a psychological pressure cooker where every officer was a suspected traitor and every shadow held a ghost. Adolf Hitler was no longer the triumphant conqueror of 1940. He was a shuffling, grey-faced figure, his left arm hanging limp and a persistent tremor betraying a nervous system in total collapse. Following the July 20th assassination attempt, where he had been blown nearly to pieces by a briefcase bomb, his detachment from reality had turned into a fanatical willpower paradigm. To Hitler, the catastrophe on the Normandy front, where his armies had been pulverized and chased across France, was not a failure of logistics or strategy, but a failure of belief. He spent his hours hunched over maps, his eyes fixed on the jagged, wooded terrain of the Ardennes. He was obsessing over a Wagnerian gamble that his generals whispered was madness. He sought to replicate the sickle-cut victory of 4 years prior, a lightning thrust that would split the British and American coalition at its seam and drive a wedge all the way to the port of Antwerp. It was a plan born of desperation and physical decay, a final, convulsive effort to force a negotiated peace through sheer bloody-minded audacity. As the weather prophets at sea confirmed the approaching darkness, the order was cut. The German military would mass in silence, moving under the cover of the very fog they had predicted. They were preparing to launch a strike that would either save the Reich or ensure its spectacular, fiery end. The silence of the Ardennes in early December 1944 was not the silence of peace, but a heavy, artificial stillness that tasted of damp pine and wet wool. In the grand, chandeliered rooms of the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles, the Allied High Command breathed an air of supreme, almost toxic confidence. This was the era of victory fever, a psychological fog that had settled over the generals as thickly as the winter mist. To the men moving pins across maps in heated offices, the German army was a broken beast, capable only of a desperate, huddling defense. They looked at the Ardennes, a jagged landscape of deep ravines and dense forests, and saw a quiet sector. It was a convenient dumping ground for green divisions to find their legs and exhausted veteran units to soak their feet. It was a logical conclusion drawn by professional men, but it was a conclusion built on a foundation of lethal hubris. 30 miles to the east, in the border town of Vianden, Elise Delay did not have the luxury of strategic maps. She had the evidence of her own eyes and the terrifying vibration of the earth. Inside the Hotel Heinz, she watched through frost-rimmed windows as the silent build-up became a physical weight. Under the shroud of night, the German machine was pouring into the Eifel. She saw the dark, angular silhouettes of assault boats being hauled toward the riverbanks. She watched the endless, spectral columns of grey-clad men moving with a ghostly, practiced quiet. When she brought these specific, harrowing details to the Allied intelligence officers, her words vanished into a bureaucratic vacuum. She was a civilian, and her reports were dismissed as anecdotal, clashing with the prevailing narrative that the enemy was spent. The intelligence apparatus, from the codebreakers in England to the desks at First Army, had become a closed loop of confirmation bias. They were so convinced of their own upcoming offensives that they dismissed the roar of German engines as mere nervousness or the sound of local troop rotations. On the front lines, the sensory reality was screaming what the headquarters refused to hear. Lieutenant Joe Sawyer stood in a frozen foxhole, his breath blooming in the frigid air, listening to a sound that made the hair on his neck prickle. It was the low, rhythmic thrum of heavy armor. It was the distinctive metallic clank of tank treads and the groaning of overstressed engines echoing through the trees. It was not the sound of a retreating army. It was the sound of a predator gathering its muscles. When Sawyer and other junior officers telephoned their concerns back to the rear, the responses were patronizing, almost mocking. The voices would crackle over the wire, asking if the men were simply getting jumpy. The command structure had become paralyzed by its own professionalism. They were unable to fathom that an enemy facing total collapse would attempt a move so strategically reckless. This blind spot was anchored by the Rundstedt myth. The Allied planners, particularly men like Dwight D. Eisenhower and Omar N. Bradley, viewed the war as a game played against a rational opponent. They respected Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as a gentleman of the old Prussian school, a man who followed the cold, logical calculus of war. Their intelligence summaries were filtered through this lens. They assumed Rundstedt would never attack through the Ardennes in winter because he lacked the fuel, the air cover, and the reserves to sustain it. It was a perfectly logical deduction, and it was completely wrong. They failed to realize that the professional general was merely a figurehead, a decorative mask for the fireman Walther model, and the fanatical, drugged-up whims of Adolf Hitler. The Allies were looking for a military solution, but they were facing a Wagnerian suicide pact. While the intelligence officers enjoyed their evening scotch and debated the logistics of the spring advance, the silent forest floor just miles away was teeming with nearly 300,000 men and 1,000 tanks. The Germans had moved 2,000 trainloads of supplies under the very noses of Allied reconnaissance. They used the clatter of the tracks to drown out the sounds of the final assembly. The quiet sector was a loaded spring, held back only by the ticking of a watch. By the evening of December 15th, the disconnect was absolute. The Allied commanders were sleeping in warm beds, convinced the war was a matter of math. In the dark woods, the German soldiers were tightening their chin straps, waiting for the 0530 signal. That signal would turn the quiet Ardennes into a screaming frozen hell. The atmosphere inside the Adlerhorst bunker complex, on the eve of the offensive, was a suffocating blend of medieval ritual and a modern-day purge. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Walther Model had spent their lives governed by the rigid aristocratic codes of the Prussian officer corps. But on this night, they were subjected to a final, stinging humiliation. Before entering the conference room, they were forced to surrender their sidearms to SS guards, who searched them with a clinical, lingering suspicion. It was as if they were common criminals rather than the architects of the defense of the Reich. This was the long shadow of the July 20th assassination attempt made manifest. The military culture had been stripped of its moral courage and hollowed out by a paranoid regime that no longer trusted its own geniuses. Inside the pine-paneled room, under the watchful, cold stare of the inner circle, the generals were forced to sign a death pledge of absolute secrecy and loyalty. The professional military mind favored a limited, realistic strike to pinch off the American lines, but that voice of reason was effectively silenced. Adolf Hitler, his eyes blazing with a frantic, drug-induced lucidity, demanded nothing less than the big solution. He ordered a 125-mile dash to Antwerp to collapse the Allied coalition. It was a strategic mismatch of catastrophic proportions. The Führer was moving imaginary divisions across a map, while the men who actually had to lead them knew they were standing on a foundation of sand. This ideological rot trickled down from the bunker to the forest floor, where the traditional army was being cannibalized by the Waffen-SS. The appointment of Sepp Dietrich to command the 6th Panzer Army was the ultimate signal of this shift. Dietrich was no strategist. He was a former tank sergeant major, a brawler who embodied the no-prisoner ethos of the Eastern Front. His men moved through the Eifel forest with a predatory, dark energy. They carried with them the trauma of the firestorm at Düren on November 16th. They remembered scraping civilians from the walls, a memory that had calcified into a fanatical desire for retribution. To these men, the Ardennes was not a tactical problem to be solved. It was a stage for a Wagnerian twilight of the gods. They lived by a simple, brutal arithmetic. We accept death, and we hand out death. As they checked the seals on their gas masks and sharpened their combat knives in the freezing dark, they weren't just preparing for a battle. They were preparing to export the savage, lawless total war of the East into the heart of Western Europe. But behind this veneer of fanaticism lay the grim logistical reality of a dying empire. This was a war by internal combustion that had run out of fuel and reverted to the age of the muscle and the hoof. While the propaganda reels fixated on the terrifying silhouette of the King Tiger tank, the actual backbone of the German 7th Army was a pathetic, horse-drawn anachronism. In the pre-dawn gloom of mid-December, the mechanized juggernaut sounded less like a roaring engine and more like the rhythmic, wet thud of 50,000 horses struggling through the knee-deep Belgian mud. For the young infantrymen, the war was a sensory collision of the medieval and the modern. 16-year-old boys, their helmets wobbling on heads too small for them, walked alongside elderly naval transfers who had never fired a rifle in anger. They wore mismatched thin uniforms that smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. They survived on horse steaks and the bitter, metallic taste of fake coffee. There was the stench of lice-ridden tunics and the sharp, acidic tang of horse manure that hung in the frozen air. Bicycle messengers weaved through columns of horse-drawn carts, carrying artillery pieces from 1914. Their tires slipped on the slick, corduroy log roads the Germans had desperately laid to keep the offensive from sinking into the earth. These soldiers moved in a state of total exhaustion, their eyes fixed on the stiff, frozen boots of the man in front of them. They were a hollowed-out force comprised of the very young and the very old. They were tasked with executing a plan that required the precision of a scalpel, but they provided only the blunt weight of a rusted hammer. As the 0530 hour approached, the big solution sat on the shoulders of these shivering boys and their dying horses. It was a final, desperate gamble that ignored reality in favor of a madman's dream. At 0530 on the morning of December 16, 1944, the horizon did not just brighten, it erupted. 2,000 German guns tore the pre-dawn silence into jagged ribbons. It was a volcanic symphony of steel that lasted for 90 minutes. To the young American infantrymen shivering in their foxholes, the sky seemed to collapse. This was the dividend paid by the weather prophets. A ceiling of heavy charcoal-grey clouds hung so low it felt as if one could reach up and touch the gloom. The Allied air forces were effectively blinded. Beneath this shroud, the Germans unleashed artificial moonlight. Massive searchlights bounced off the low cloud cover, creating a ghostly, flickering light. The Ardennes became a landscape of long, dancing shadows and terrifying uncertainty. The thin American line did not just buckle, it splintered. By December 21st, the German offensive had thrust its head deep into the American gut. But the momentum was beginning to grate against the friction of reality. At the village of Hotton, the elite German armor found its lightning advance strangled by a bridge and a patchwork of men who had no business being heroes. Inside the village, the air was a thick, freezing soup of diesel fumes and the smell of wet soot. Captain Jack B. Warden looked out over a makeshift barricade of overturned trucks and scavenged timber. His line was manned not by elite paratroopers, but by a team of clerks, mechanics, and engineers who had swapped their wrenches for rifles. The sensory overload was absolute. The mechanical scream of Panther tanks echoed off the stone walls of the village. They emerged from the morning mist like prehistoric predators. The Americans did not have heavy armor. They had ingenuity and a 40mm anti-aircraft gun. As a Panther tank lurched toward the bridge, the world narrowed down to the rhythmic thump of the gun. The mechanics watched, hearts hammering against their ribs, as the high-velocity shells slammed into the German steel. They did not just fire, they hunted. They aimed for the vulnerable gap between the turret and the hull, wedging shells into the neck of the beast to jam its rotation. The smell of burning rubber and scorched paint filled the air as the Panther caught fire. Its crew scrambled from the turret into the biting wind. For 2 days, this patchwork force held the line. They turned a vital logistical artery into a graveyard of armored husks. The German blitz was dying in the mud of a village street. It was being suffocated by the very fuel shortages and logistical nightmares that Hitler had chosen to ignore. While the Greyhound stalled at Hotton, the strategic heart of the battle shifted 30 miles south to a small road junction called Bastogne. By December 22nd, the town was the hole in the donut, completely encircled by a massive German Panzer Corps. Inside the perimeter, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne and the remnants of the 10th Armored lived in a grueling green nightmare. The ground was frozen so hard that digging a foxhole required plastic explosives or a desperate bone-jarring effort with an entrenching tool. Soldiers subsisted on the metallic frozen taste of K-rations, often sucking on the crackers just to get enough moisture to swallow. The psychological toll was etched into their faces, a look known as the Ardennes stare. It was a profound, hollow-eyed fatigue, born of zero sleep and the constant, rhythmic thud of German screaming Mimi rockets. Men huddled in pits where the scent of cordite never left their clothes, their feet numbing into blocks of ice as they struggled against trench foot. The silence between barrages was worse than the noise. It was a frozen, alien landscape where every snapping twig sounded like a bolt being cycled. When the German emissaries arrived under a white flag, demanding surrender to avoid total annihilation, they were met with something they did not expect. They were met with the visceral professional defiance of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. His one-word response, "Nuts," was not just a quote. It was a physical manifestation of the American soldiers' refusal to break. The siege of Bastogne became the definitive anchor of the campaign, a grinding war of attrition that forced the German command to divert vital divisions away from their primary objectives. The German soldiers outside the town, facing their own inevitable end, looked toward the pocket with a mix of professional respect and growing despair. They were the firemen of a dying regime, watching as their decisive strike bled out in the snow. The white landscape was increasingly stained red, not just with blood, but with the wreckage of a Nazi war machine that had finally overreached. As the fog began to thin and the first hint of a clear sky appeared, the men in the foxholes knew the weather prophet's time had run out. The rupture had been made, but the anchor of Bastogne held firm, shifting the momentum from a German breakthrough to a slow, agonizing retreat through the deep, rusting forests of the Ardennes. Now, we return to the storm-tossed Atlantic and the sterile bunkers of Berlin, where the weather prophets have finally run out of time. The gargantuan atmospheric wall that the U-1232 had tracked through the churning North Atlantic was finally crumbling. Its protective shroud of grey mist was fraying at the edges. In the Corrali bunker, the meteorologists watched their barometers with a sinking, hollow dread. The high-pressure system was shifting, and the weather weapon that had grounded the Allied air forces was about to expire. On the morning of December 23rd, the suffocating charcoal ceiling over the Ardennes did not just lift. It shattered. For the German soldiers huddled in the frozen ruts of the Skyline Drive, the sudden appearance of a pale winter sun was not a blessing. It was a death warrant. The blinding, cruel clarity of a blue sky meant that the silent build-up was over. The winged American reptile Hitler had so feared was finally descending. The transition was visceral and violent. One moment the forest was a muffled world of white and grey. The next, the air was filled with the terrifying high-pitched whistle of P-47 thunderbolts and typhoons. This was the Jarboe terror made manifest. A German tanker, perhaps peeking from the hatch of a Panther, would have seen the horizon suddenly teem with hundreds of silver specks. Each one trailed a plume of white exhaust. The sensory experience was a crushing cacophony of 850 caliber machine guns ripping silk and the gut-shaking crump of napalm canisters. The fighter-bomber racecourse turned the narrow, icy roads into a slaughterhouse. Horses, the overlooked backbone of the offensive, screamed as they were caught in the strafing runs, their blood steaming in the sub-zero air. The German columns, once a menacing tide, became a static, charred graveyard of steel. By the final days of December, the Wagnerian gamble had devolved into a logistical autopsy. The most formidable weapons of the Reich, the 68-ton King Tigers and the predatory Hetzers, were being found abandoned in perfect condition. Their engines were cold, and their crews had vanished into the tree line. The silence of these machines was the most profound indictment of Hitler's big solution. They had not been defeated by superior armor, but by the simple, agonizing emptiness of a fuel tank. The Red Ball Express and the Allied war by internal combustion had outpaced the German willpower paradigm. The German infantry were now stubble hoppers in the truest sense, retreating through the same frozen alien landscape they had entered with such fanatical hope. Their Ardennes stare was now a permanent mask of defeat. The scent of cordite was replaced by the smell of scorched rubber and the sweet, sickly odor of thawing corpses as the relentless winter began to yield. This brings us back to the frozen alien landscape where Hitler's Arminius complex finally met its reckoning. The Führer had sought to replicate the Teutoburg Forest massacre, envisioning himself as a modern Hermann crushing the Roman legions of the West. Yet as the Allied pincer closed and the Bulge was flattened, the Ardennes became the tomb of that mythology. The legacy of the forest remains a physical weight. Even today, the pretty and quaint woods of Belgium and Luxembourg yield the mangled mess tins and rusted entrenching tools of men who fought in a grueling green nightmare. In a haunting historical echo, the 1987 discovery of Roman coins and slingshot remnants at the actual site of the Teutoburg massacre served as a final symbolic closure to Hitler's dark forest-born fantasies. The Wagnerian ring had been broken, not by ancient Teutonic gods, but by the industrial scale and professional maturity of a United States Army. They had entered the woods as battle babies and emerged as a hardened, unstoppable force. The Battle of the Bulge was the moment the American military reached its full, grim maturity. It proved that the risk of being pushed back to the Normandy beaches had been a visceral reality, not a myth. It cost a pint of sweat and a gallon of blood, leaving behind a frozen graveyard that effectively dictated the shape of the final advance on Berlin. As the last German tanks ran dry and the silent build-up dissolved into a frantic retreat, the offensive exhausted the Nazi war machine's final reserves of material and soul. The Ardennes, once a quiet sector dismissed by arrogant planners, was solidified as a permanent reminder of the long shadows of war. The difference between a country club victory and a catastrophic defeat is measured in the ingenuity of a mechanic with a wrench and the professional determination of a soldier who refuses to move. The ghosts of the campaign remain the final silent witnesses to the moment the Third Reich's offensive capability died in the cold grey mist of the Ardennes. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories for the generations to come. And please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.